Welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined as always by my co-host Ben Anderson. Ben, we have a national champion, the UConn Huskies, as expected, or I guess as expected for the last couple of days, last week or so. At this point, will be the 2023 national champion. How does that sound to you?
As someone who picked it right from the start, it sounds fantastic to me, but I think they were clearly also the most dominant team that we saw in the entire tournament. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, aside from the fact that they won, dominant, I'd say, really, in the last 10 to 15 years, there's really only, two contestants in terms of just purely margin of victory on average, right?
Sure. Margin of victory. Yeah, I think you could make an argument for a few teams: 2021 Baylor, 2018 Villanova, 2016 Villanova, 2012 Kentucky. That's probably what you're looking at, right?
Yeah, and you can even go back to 2009 UNC, but yeah, that was definitely a pretty anticlimactic, I would say, national championship game, but a great tournament overall. So we're going to talk about both of them in this episode. We're going to wrap up the tournament, give some superlatives, but we're also first going to start just by recapping this last game of the 2022 to 2023 college basketball season. So we have the UConn Huskies beating the San Diego State Aztecs 76-59. Now, on one hand, it wasn't a real 17-point win. On the other hand, it was also not exciting at the end in a way that there was really any point in the second half where we thought San Diego State was going to have a chance to be competitive to win the game. I felt like UConn asserted themselves early. San Diego State, to their credit, did stick around. It was around a 10-point margin for a majority of the game, and then they sort of made a run at the end. I think they cut it to 5-ish?
5. Yeah.
They cut it to 5. But their offense just wasn't strong enough. They went on multiple droughts. UConn isn't a team that you are going to be able to stop consistently. That's San Diego State's bread and butter, is making stops. UConn's offense was just too good. To put it simply, San Diego State's offense was not built for it. And once again, UConn with a 17-point, a double-digit win for UConn. They sweep the 6-game March Madness slate with all double-digit wins.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit on the fact that I never felt San Diego State could come back and take the lead. When they did cut it to 5, I was like, okay, we might have a game, because that was with about 5 minutes left in the game. And the problem with that, though, was that the shot that they made right there to cut it to 5, it felt like that should have been the shot to tie the game, not to cut it to only 5 if they were going to truly have a shot, which is unfortunate. I was hoping that they would sort of have another 14-point comeback in them like they had against Florida Atlantic in particular. But like you said, the Huskies are a different breed when it comes to coming back in the game. It's just so hard. They're so versatile. Donovan Clingan, I think, really made things a mess for the Aztecs inside the paint. Usually they're a heavy driving team, and it seemed that they were just scared to go anywhere near the basket when he was on the court. Did you notice anything else in particular?
No, not really, honestly, because from an expert perspective, this was not very different than one would have expected, like given the matchup. If you've watched both of these teams all season, you've watched UConn play their games, you've watched San Diego State play their games. The game pretty much went exactly how one would have expected. I guess it was slightly disappointing because, like I said to open the episode, it was pretty anticlimactic. But regardless, congratulations to UConn. They were a very entertaining product. There were points during the regular season where they were as dominant as they were in the tournament. There were also points in the regular season where we thought that they were potentially fraudulent. And it was hard to explain how they went from one extreme to the other, but they're back at the right extreme now. And yeah, UConn is national championship number 5 for them.
5 in 25 years, passing Kansas. in all-time titles, which I think is a conversation for the offseason about maybe the blue blood status of the sport.
Yeah.
But that's something we can get into later. Congratulations to Danny Hurley. That was such a cool moment for him, especially given back in 2020 when he was like, hey, you better catch us now because we're coming, right?
Yeah.
And to hold true to his word and to see him celebrate, especially with his son, who's a walk-on, who got to play that last final minute. Just a super cool experience, I think, for everyone all around in that Connecticut program.
All right, so let's get to our overall tournament wrap up because, like I said, there's not a ton to talk about regarding this last game, but there is a ton to talk about. It was another, in my opinion, a very exciting March Madness, and this one was definitely the year of parity versus last year, more the year of blue bloods. But we're going to just give our superlatives. Here's the thing. We're going to go through our best player, our best game through each round, through the Elite Eight, our best play, best coach, and best upset. So we're going to go through those superlatives. Some of the answers will be obvious. So here's the catch. Ben and I are going to go back and forth, but you cannot say the same answer as the other person said. So we are going to have to give two different answers to each prompt. So Ben, you'll be able to go first for this first one. Who do you think was the best player in this 2023 March Madness?
So when I think of best player, I want it to be someone on the national championship team, but also make sure that they were consistently great throughout the tournament. And I think Adama Sanogo fits that category for this purpose. He was the best player on UConn throughout the whole tournament, even though I believe Jordan Hawkins won the West Region Most Outstanding Player. He won the Final Four MOP. He averaged 19.5 points per game on super efficient shooting throughout the entire tournament. Just a joy to watch. And he really showed some of his versatility as well, whether that was shooting some threes against their Final Four game against Miami, or that was showing his passing ability against Gonzaga where he had 6 assists. I think he showed that he was more than just a big bruiser down low. So I would vote Adama Sanogo as the best player in the tournament.
That was my pick as well. The most important player on the national champion. Obviously, that's your pick. But since I have to give a different answer, I am not going to give an answer to a player who was even in the Final Four. This guy played 4 games out of 6 possible games, but Marquise Noel was just, I felt, independent of team success, the storyline of this tournament. And he had 23.5 points per game, 13.5 assists per game, 42% from three-point range. So you're going to give credit to the most important player on the national champion. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to give credit to not only the best statistical contributor in this tournament, but just the overall storyline. I think a lot of people learn Marquise Noel's name for the first time in this tournament and just became instant fans of his play and his just electricity on the court.
I like that answer too. I think you can't go wrong with either of those two players. Now we'll go ahead and move on to our second pick. Dan, what was the best game in the round of 64?
So the best game in the round of 64, there were a couple that you could have gone with, probably more than 2 that I would be fine giving the answer to this prompt. But I'm going to say TCU, Arizona State, the 6 versus the 11. The 60 TCU won that one 72-70. First off, aside from the ending, the 3 balls were flying for both teams. It was just an electric back and forth. 3 baskets in the final 30 seconds that were important. I think TCU scored, then Arizona State scored, and then ultimately the game winner by Jacoby Coles for TCU. We had a Mike Miles 26-point performance for TCU. Incredible game. It was pretty much locked in from the start. So that's the indication, especially in the round of 64 where there's so many games to choose from to watch. TCU, Arizona State had me hooked.
I like that answer. I actually wasn't one of the 2 I was prepping for. That's not what I expected, but that's a really good game as well. I was glad I was able to stay up for that one. My answer is going to be Xavier versus Kennesaw State. The 3 versus 14 matchup in the Midwest region was just a super fun atmosphere. If you can remember, if you had watched the ASUN championship game that was at Kennesaw State, their fans are as passionate as any mid-major that you can see, and they certainly brought that atmosphere, that energy to the game in the round of 64, and it was a great game overall as well. Kennesaw State led for a bunch of that game, although Adam Kunkel hit a huge three at the near the end to put the Musketeers up 67-65, and they were able to pull away from there. Chris Youngblood was fantastic during that game for the Owls, and Jerome Hunter for Xavier, 24 points, sort of a role player showing out in the tournament is something we always like to see. I really enjoyed watching that game from start to finish.
All right, how about the round of 32? You're going to go first for this one.
So for this pick, it was actually a tough one. I think there were a lot of options that you could go for, but ultimately I leaned towards Kansas State and Kentucky. The storyline of Marquise Noel being able to go back to his hometown of New York City to play in the second weekend of the NCAA tournament was huge. I really enjoyed seeing that for him, and he was able to drop 27-9 and be the most important player on the Wildcats in order to go back and play in front of his hometown. So that was a really cool point. Kason Wallace and Oscar Tshiebwe combined for 46 points. Tshiebwe also had 18 rebounds by himself, just a superhuman performance by the Wildcats center, but ultimately it wasn't enough to defeat Kansas State, and they moved on to the tournament. That was the game I enjoyed watching the most, I think.
Yeah, same thing here. I didn't have that in my top two, but very respectable, very practical answer. I'm going to go Kansas, Arkansas. I was back and forth between that and another game. I'm going to go Kansas, Arkansas. So number 8, Arkansas got the upset over the 1 seed Kansas. Final score 72-71. 3 scorers had at least 20 points. Arkansas's Devontae Davis and Ricky Council, and Kansas's Jalen Wilson. It had, I feel like, a good balance of a nice fast pace, but also played cleanly and crisp on both ends, which is very important for me for both the excitement factor and just being a basketball fan and liking good quality, well-played basketball. And it came down to the final seconds. I feel like that's a key criteria for a good game. And Jalen Wilson was down 2. He had 1 free throw left. I think he inadvertently made the free throw, and Arkansas was able to inbound it and waste the final couple seconds of the game. And it also had the element of the upset, because I don't think many of us were expecting Kansas to go down in the first weekend, but they did.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most common answer you'll hear from a lot of college basketball fans. Just for me, it had a little bit too much ref ball in the last few minutes of that game. There were a lot of fouls called, so that's why I leaned Kentucky, Kansas State. But still, as always, a great answer. You can't go wrong here. Now let's go ahead and move on to the Sweet 16. Dan, what was your pick here? I'm very interested to hear.
Yeah, I'm going Kansas State, Michigan State. So a lot of Kansas State mention on this exercise. Kansas State won this one 98-93. This game deserved overtime. It got overtime. Noel had 20 and 19. AJ Hoggard had 25 for Michigan State. 24 total 3-point baskets made between the two teams. And there were late heroics in regulation. Tyson Walker for Michigan State. There were late heroics in overtime. Ish Massoud for Kansas State. I feel like this game had everything you could have asked for in a March Madness game.
Yeah, and you didn't even mention the lob from Noel Keontae Johnson. That also
I'll get there.
What a fantastic play. I think it's one of the highlights of the whole tournament. But yeah, I think there were 2 options that you could have gone for. Kansas State was actually number 2 for me. The number 1 game in my mind was Gonzaga UCLA. I mean, if you want a game of runs, this is the game of runs. And given the history between the 2 teams, both on the West Coast, and the 2 first times they played in the tournament were both bangers. If you think about 2006 with UCLA beating Gonzaga with a comeback versus 2021, Jalen Suggs buzzer beater. This was sort of the rubber match for the two teams, which I really enjoyed. UCLA jumped out to a 13-point halftime lead. Gonzaga came all the way back, actually led by 9 with about 2 minutes left. Then the Zags blew the lead, right? And so that Amari Bailey hit a big shot to give the Bruins, put the Bruins up on the scoreboard. But then, of course, Julian Strother comes back, hits a logo 3 on the Villanova game-winning play to send the Zags to the Elite 8. Drew Timme had 36 points in this game. He was absolutely unstoppable, especially in the first half. Just an overall great ending to that night.
Yeah, it's got to be one of those 2. So I'm glad we were able to talk about both. But Elite Eight, this one I feel like there's one answer, and I'll let you say it. What was the best game in the Elite Eight?
It's got to be Miami, Texas, in my mind. Is that not the game you were thinking of?
Oh, go for it though.
Interesting. So Miami, let's talk about this game. The Longhorns were up 13. A lot of 13-point leads blown in this tournament. And I understand why you might think one is the other clear answer, but just the storylines behind this game, I'm talking more of like what was on the line. You have Jim Larinaga, arguably the most beloved coach across all national fans of college basketball, trying to take Miami, a program who actually shuttered basketball for a couple of decades back in the 20th century, trying to take a program that has zero history of success to the Final Four, like he did with George Mason. And then on the other side, you have Rodney Terry, a guy who didn't start off at the season as Texas's head basketball coach, trying to take that team to the Final Four for the first time, I believe, since 2003. So you had all of these storylines coming back to what I think is a really good game. You had Jordan Miller perform basically perfectly, right? 27 points, didn't miss a shot either from the field nor the free throw line. And you had Miami ultimately find a way to come back from 13 down in the second half to send Larinaga back to the Final Four in Houston. So that's my argument for Miami, Texas.
Okay. I just thought you were going to clearly say FAU, Kansas State. 79-76 final score. This was one of two games that came down to the end, and I guess you're more looking at the full 40-minute body of work, which is fair, because the other game that went down to the end was San Diego State Creighton, which is the worst possible 1-point game that was decided in the final seconds you could possibly think of. But yeah, FAU Kansas State, great offense, just lots of transition. I think 22 Florida Atlantic turnovers definitely helped, although they did win the game. And I think when it comes down to March Madness, I think the endings are really what you're going to remember in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's why I emphasize those so much over the full body of work or the 40 minutes. But I guess as we speak 1 week and a half removed from the game, that's a fair answer.
Yeah, I don't think you could go wrong with either one. My first gut pick was Florida Atlantic, Kansas State, but ultimately switched it to Miami, Texas, because I think that was a little bit more interesting from a wide range of options. All right, so that covers all of our games here. Let's move on to the best play. Dan, what is your answer here?
Yeah, well, you already mentioned it, the Marquise Noel. So
I'm sorry, I stole your thunder. I didn't even think you're going to do that, actually.
Yeah, well, that is definitely my best play. I'll just explain it for those who have definitely seen it for at least 200 times, but it's just that good. It's worth acknowledging again. So this was against Michigan State. Noel already balling out. He ended up having, like I said, 20 points, 19 assists in this game. And he's dribbling the ball up the court casually, acting like he's having some sort of argument with his coach on the sideline. All of a sudden, Keontae Johnson just back cuts towards the basket. Noel throws a no-look alley-oop. Johnson catches it and behind his back dunks the ball into the hoop. It was incredible. Noel, like I said, the storyline of this tournament, but that was his signature play right there.
I think that's a great answer. That's not the answer I thought you were going to give. But let me tell you about the play that I picked. Okay. It's going to pain me to say this, but I think the absolute play of the game was Furman's game-winning 3-point shot against Virginia. Look, and the reason I say this is because this is the quintessential March Madness play. This would never happen in the NBA. This would never happen outside of a pressure-filled single elimination tournament, in my mind, right? If you're not familiar with the play, Virginia's up 2. Kihei Clark is being pressured in the backcourt. He's trapped in the corner, sort of throws it behind his head. He thinks he sees Shedrick. The pass is well short. Furman intercepts it and hits a 3-point shot with 2.7 seconds left to take the lead, or something around that number. That was the play that left my mouth wide open, right? My jaw dropped. Yeah. And that's the reason I would pick it. I think that's the play outside of the Lamont Butler game winner in the Final Four that's going to live on in highlight reels. So that's why I picked that one.
But that could the thing is that play could easily be argued if we're doing anti-superlatives and we're doing the worst play. Because it was a great clutch deep 3-point shot. On the other hand, the storyline of that play was Kihei Clark, what the heck are you doing?
Sure, and maybe you think of best play differently than I do, but I from best play I was thinking, okay, what am I going to remember?
Okay,
from this tournament, and I think you had 3 great options. I think you had that play, I think you had Butler's game winner, and I think you had the Johnson dunk.
Yeah, well, that's why I wanted to do where we both can't say the same answer, because we could acknowledge kind of both and have different perspectives on these questions. But
For sure.
All right, we are going to now talk about who was the best coach of this tournament. Which coach impressed you the most? I'm very interested to see where you take this one.
Okay. I don't care that this coach won 2 games and lost 1 game in the tournament. The game plan that Coach Tobin Anderson had to beat Purdue was the best sort of strategic set of decisions that we saw all tournament, in my opinion. Because not only did a 16 seed beat a 1 seed for only the second time in tournament history, this was the smallest team in Division I, according to effective height, right? Going against the National Player of the Year in Zach Edey, who also happened to be 7'4", right? There's no reason that this game should have been nearly the struggle that it was for Purdue. And yet, Coach Anderson's game plan of making sure that he was always pressing and just forcing Purdue's guards and wings to shoot, which they just had a historically bad night, but that's the breaks in the NCAA tournament. You coach to where you think that your team has the best shot to win, even though that might not be a situation where you coach in that manner in any other game that you ever play. That's the situation that Fairleigh Dickinson found themselves in. And I think to come up with that game plan was really incredible. And to follow it up, frankly, with a closer than expected game against FAU, I think he showed his coaching abilities to the max in this game. And that's how he got Iona a job directly after Ray Pitino left and directly after the tournament. I think Tobin Anderson has to be the coach of the year. Or the coach of the tournament, excuse me.
Yeah. If we're talking, I agree, because I interpreted this as not what you did the entire year, but what you did just in these games. And I agreed. It was definitely Anderson. And I think we'll talk about this more in the coaching episodes that we'll do it in the future, but it's kind of weird how one game got him a job that he potentially deserved with his body of work in Division II for decades. But that's just how it works. We'll talk about that more. But for my answer, there were a couple options. So first I'll acknowledge the ones that I'm not going to go with. I know San Diego State was a big underdog. They made it to the national championship. I am not going to go with San Diego State head coach Brian Dutcher. I felt like that was more of a players-based thing, especially like you talk about the Butler buzzer beater. Even in his post-game press conference, he said, I didn't call timeout. I ran out of plays. He just made a play. And I'm like, okay, so how am I going to give credit to great coaching on that? Jerome Tang for Kansas State. Now, coach of the year deserved, in my opinion. However, much more for what he did in the regular season, what he did in the last offseason than what he did in the tournament. So he was talked about a lot in the tournament, but because of what he did to get his team in the position to be the 3 seed, not because of the individual tournament games. So neither of those common answers are what I'm going to pick. Instead, I'm going to pick Dusty May for Florida Atlantic. Similar reasons, but I think he just was able to outplan teams, especially that were toss-ups or that he was maybe slight favorites to slight underdogs in. And I think Florida Atlantic going to the Final Four was equally impressive that he got his team to 30, however many wins during the regular season. But the fact that now they made that tournament run and they defied expectations and defied the mid-major narratives, I got to give it to Dusty May. If we're not doing Anderson, because that was your answer, but that was my clear number one.
I think that's a great answer. You can't really go wrong. You had so many great coaching performances, in my opinion, in this tournament and this year in general. So a lot of names to give flowers to. All right. We got the last one. We got what everyone comes to March Madness for. Dan, what was your biggest upset of this tournament?
Oh, that's a very tough one. Very, very tough one. No, we've talked about this. Number 16, Fairleigh Dickinson being number 1, Purdue. We've already discussed it in depth several times, but 16 being a 1 has now happened just 2 times, and just so many flowers to be given for Fairleigh Dickinson. And yeah, that was definitely of the 2 16-1 upsets, that was the one that the first one was just a shocker. Like, nobody could believe what happened. This one was super exciting and having me on the edge of my seat the whole game. So either way, yeah, number 16 over a 1 will always be the answer to this question.
It's a great answer. You can't go wrong there. For mine, I will go with what is normally the biggest upset that you'll see in the March Madness tournament. This is the only time both a 15 and a 16 seed have won a game in this tournament. And if you wanted to talk about coaches, I believe we named 4 total, given that you named a couple in addition to your pick there. If we want to round out a top 5, let's talk about Princeton coach Mitch Henderson, right? The way he game planned against Arizona in particular was super impressive, given that the fact that he plays his best player, who is a 6'8" forward in Tosan. Just, it's so hard against the Wildcats, given their size up front, to not put your star player in foul trouble. And he managed to do that, managed to force Arizona into shots that they didn't like, and ultimately won the game, making him the 12th, I believe, 15 over a 2 seed in NCAA history. And then talk about what they did in the round of 32. They smacked Missouri. Like, this game wasn't really close, right? And to show their promise going into this game to go to the Sweet 16 was super impressive, in my opinion. And they really hung with Creighton. This was a single digits game at the under 4 timeout, I believe, as well. So they had a real chance to be the second team ever to go to the Elite 8. I think that Princeton is the clear second choice here.
All right. Well, that will do it for today's episode of the CBB Review Studio podcast. We will be back in the near future. There's so much transfer portal stuff to talk about. There's so much coaching carousel stuff to talk about. That stuff mostly in the past. But, man, it's barely the off season when it comes to content at CBB Review and just in college basketball in general. But everyone, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and take care.